Welcome to the Explainer. So today we're looking squarely at Chapter 4A of the Factory Act of 1948. Specifically, we're zeroing in on the provisions relating to hazardous processes covering Section 41E right through to 41H. If you've ever wondered, how the law actually balances the massive demands of heavy industry with the absolute necessity of keeping humans safe, well, you're in exactly the right place. Because these aren't just abstract rules. Safety regulations are, quite literally, often written in blood following past industrial accidents. So understanding them, absolutely crucial.
Okay, let's dive into this. Who is actually responsible when factory work turns hazardous? I mean, think about it. When chemicals are mixing, machines are roaring, and the stakes are quite literally life and death, where does the buck actually stop? This isn't just some legal hypothetical, right? It's the beating heart of Chapter 4A. To really wrap our heads around these laws, we have to look at how accountability is distributed when the work environment inherently carries immense risk.
So here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, regulating hazardous factory work. Second, setting emergency safety standards. Third, limits on toxic exposure. Fourth, workers and safety committees. And finally, the right to warn. We're going to look at the shield of government regulation and the sword of worker empowerment. Let's get to it.
Section 1. Regulating hazardous factory work. Understanding the basics of Chapter 4A.
Right, so Chapter 4A is entirely dedicated to the unique, elevated risks found in hazardous manufacturing processes. It basically lays out the framework for who is in charge and what mechanisms exist to prevent catastrophes before they happen. Now, to make sense of all this, we need to define a crucial term that pops up throughout the Factory Act, and that is the occupier. Now, this isn't just anyone who happens to be in the building. No, it's the specific person or manager who has ultimate control over the affairs of the factory and its hazardous processes. When it comes to this dangerous stuff, the law intentionally pinpoints this individual as the one legally on the hook for ensuring these strict safety protocols are actually put into practice.
Section 2. Setting emergency safety standards. Breaking down Section 41E.
Okay, so this is where we see the government stepping in, acting as a protective, top-down shield. Look, sometimes industries evolve way faster than the permanent rulebooks can keep up with, right? So here is the specific bureaucratic chain of command under Section 41E to handle exactly that scenario. Step 1. The central government identifies a safety gap. Maybe no standards exist for a brand new hazardous process, or the current ones are just totally inadequate. Step 2. They direct specialized experts, specifically the Director General of Factory Advice Service and Labor Institutes, to draft emergency standards. And then Step 3, those emergency standards are strictly enforced right away. Basically, it's a rapid response mechanism for industrial safety.
And hey, please don't let the word emergency make you think these are just, temporary guidelines or polite suggestions. Absolutely not. Section 41E explicitly states that these emergency standards are fully enforceable. They carry the exact same weight, the full force of the law, as if they were already formally incorporated into the permanent rules of the Act, at least until those permanent rules can eventually catch up.
Moving on to Section 3. Limits on toxic exposure. Breaking down Section 41F.
So while that previous section dealt with sudden emergencies, Section 41F is all about the invisible, everyday hazards of the factory floor. I'm talking about chemical and toxic substances. The big questions are, how much is too much, and who actually decides? Well, that answer is housed in a very specific part of the legislation known as the Second Schedule. Section 41F dictates that the maximum permissible threshold limits of exposure to these toxic substances in any manufacturing process, they absolutely must strictly adhere to the values indicated in this second schedule. It essentially acts as the ultimate master ledger for chemical safety limits.
Now, what's really fascinating here is that these limits are not just carved in stone forever. Science changes, right? Our understanding of toxicity evolves. And because of that, Section 41F allows the central government to update those exposure limits. But they don't just do it on a whim. They do it based specifically on new scientific proof obtained from specialized institutions or experts in the field. The law is literally designed to adapt to the latest science, which is a really smart way to keep people safe.
Okay, Section 4. Workers and safety committees. Breaking down Section 41G.
And this brilliantly illustrates a massive shift in our narrative arc. We're moving away from that top-down shield of government regulation and introducing the ground-up sword of worker participation. Because safety isn't just handed down from above, it has to be managed from within. In every factory dealing with hazardous processes, the occupier must set up a safety committee, and the law mandates a strict 50-50 split. The composition has to be 50% worker representatives and 50% management representatives. This ensures the people actually facing the risks on the floor have an equal voice at the table with the folks running the operation.
So,
What does this committee actually do day to day? Well, their duties are pretty clear. They are tasked with actively promoting worker management cooperation. They're responsible for maintaining proper safety and health. And crucially, they must periodically review the safety measures that have been put in place. It's really this proactive, continuous loop of safety management, driven by the very people inside the factory.
Now, there is a legal caveat we do need to mention here. State governments can actually issue written exemptions for factories from setting up these committees. But, and it's a big but, it cannot just be an arbitrary decision. The exemption must be an official order in writing, and the state explicitly has to record the specific reasons for granting that exemption.
Section 5. The right to warn. Breaking down Section 41H. This brings us to what is perhaps the most direct and powerful form of worker empowerment in this entire chapter, the protocol for handling situations where a disaster isn't just a possibility, but is actively unfolding. The law uses a really specific, chilling phrase, imminent danger to their lives or health. This kicks in when workers in a hazardous process have a reasonable apprehension that an accident is highly likely. It is a stark reminder of the very real, very human stakes involved here. We aren't just talking about regulatory paperwork anymore. We are talking about preventing immediate life-threatening harm.
So, when a worker spots that imminent danger, an exact escalation ladder kicks in. First, the worker spots the danger. Second, they must notify the manager or occupier, either directly or through that safety committee we talked about. But here is the critical part. They must simultaneously notify the official inspector. And third, action must be taken. Either the manager acts or the inspector makes the final decision.
What happens next really depends on the manager's response. It's a tale of two paths. If the manager agrees that there is imminent danger, it is their legal duty to take immediate remedial action and immediately send a report of that action to the nearest inspector. But what if the manager disagrees with the worker? Well, they can't simply ignore the warning. No way. If they aren't satisfied the danger exists, they are legally required to refer the matter forthwith, meaning literally right away, to the inspector.
So the crucial point is this tiebreaker. When there is a dispute between the workers on the floor who feel their lives are in danger and the management who thinks, hey, everything's fine, Section 41H explicitly states that the government inspector's decision is completely final. The ultimate authority on whether or not that immediate hazard actually exists rests entirely outside the factory's payroll.
And that wraps up our breakdown of Chapter 4A. We've seen the top-down emergency standards and toxic limits, and we've seen the ground-up power of safety committees and the right to warn. So I'll leave you with this. Does your workplace, or the industries you interact with, effectively balance the shield of government regulation with the sword of real worker empowerment? It's the balance that Chapter 4A strives for, and it is the balance that ultimately saves lives. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking the big questions.